An Emirates Boeing 777 is moments from landing in Dubai, but something is wrong. The plane is shaking violently, refusing to touch down. The captain tries to go around, but within seconds, disaster strikes. The aircraft begins to sink. 300 lives are now hanging by a thread. How did this routine landing turn into one of aviation's most terrifying near disasters? What critical errors were made in those final moments? And what lessons were learned that could save your life? This is the chilling story of Emirates Flight 521. Before we dive into this shocking aviation disaster, make sure to subscribe for more real-life crash investigations and survival stories. It was a bright summer morning in 2016 when Emirates Flight 521 prepared for takeoff. The massive Boeing 777 sat on the runway at Thiruvananthapuram International Airport in India, ready for its journey to Dubai. On board were 282 passengers and 18 crew members, most of them traveling to Dubai for work or as a stopover before reaching their final destinations. The passengers settled into their seats, unaware that in just a few hours, they would be caught in a terrifying battle for survival. In the cockpit, two experienced pilots were preparing for a routine flight. The captain, a 34-year-old Emirati, had been flying for 15 years, while the first officer, an Australian pilot, had more flight experience but had been with Emirates for only 2 years. Both had spotless safety records, and the airline itself had never lost a plane since it started in 1985. Everything seemed normal. As the engines roared to life and the plane took off, the passengers relaxed, expecting a smooth journey. But unknown to them, dangerous weather conditions awaited them in Dubai. Strong, unpredictable winds would soon turn their landing into a life-threatening emergency. As Flight 521 cruised towards Dubai, everything seemed normal. The Boeing 777 was flying at 36,000 feet, and passengers were enjoying their meals, unaware that dangerous conditions were waiting for them at their destination. The pilots received the latest weather report from Dubai, and it wasn't good news. The skies were clear, but the winds were unpredictable. A warning had just been issued for wind shear, a sudden change in wind speed and direction that could make landing extremely dangerous. Pilots usually prefer to land into the wind because it helps slow the aircraft down, making for a safer touchdown. But the winds in Dubai that day were shifting rapidly, making it difficult to predict what would happen during landing. Unknown to Flight 521 pilots, 2 other planes had already aborted their landings due to these unsafe conditions. However, since those pilots hadn't reported their reasons to air traffic control, Flight 521 crew had no idea just how risky the approach would be. As the plane began its descent, the captain and first officer discussed the conditions. They were experienced and had encountered wind shear before, but this time would be different. The threat ahead was greater than they realized. As Flight 521 descended toward Dubai International Airport, the situation grew more challenging. The Boeing 777 was lined up for landing, but the wind kept changing unpredictably. At one moment, there was a strong tailwind pushing the aircraft forward, making it harder to slow down. The next moment, a headwind appeared, increasing the plane's speed and keeping it in the air longer than expected. The pilots had to make constant adjustments to keep the approach stable. The captain manually took control of the aircraft, leaving the autopilot engaged only for throttle control. He carefully guided the plane toward the runway, expecting a smooth touchdown. However, as they got closer to the ground, the wind began pushing the plane up and down, making it difficult to maintain a steady descent. The pilots didn't realize that the worst was yet to come. In the final moments before landing, the aircraft started floating above the runway, refusing to settle. This was a critical problem. Every second in the air meant they were using up more runway, leaving less space to stop. The pilots had no idea they were already in a dangerous situation, one that could soon lead to disaster. As Flight 521 hovered just above the runway, the captain faced a critical decision. The Boeing 777 was refusing to land properly because of the shifting winds. Instead of touching down where it was supposed to, the aircraft was floating forward, using up valuable runway space. The plane's speed had increased due to a sudden headwind, creating more lift and preventing it from settling onto the ground. The captain tried to correct it by lowering the nose slightly, but the plane still wouldn't touch down. Then, a long landing warning appeared on the flight display. This meant the aircraft had already passed 1/3 of the runway without landing, making a safe stop much harder. The pilots now had to make a split-second decision: Either continue trying to land with very little runway left, or abort the landing and go around for another attempt. The captain chose to go around, thinking this was the safer option. He pressed the toga button, expecting the engines to increase power and lift the aircraft back into the air. But something was wrong. The engines remained at idle power, and the plane wasn't climbing as expected. Without realizing it, the pilots had just made a fatal mistake. As Flight 521 attempted to go around, the pilots expected the engines to increase power. But nothing happened. The throttles remained at idle, and the aircraft wasn't gaining altitude. The pilots had unknowingly triggered an automation trap. Because the wheels had briefly touched the ground earlier, the plane's system had disabled the toga function. The captain didn't notice that the engines were still at idle, and the aircraft was losing speed fast. Thinking everything was normal, the first officer retracted the flaps and landing gear, which increased drag and made the situation worse. The Boeing 777 was now dangerously slow, barely staying in the air. At just 85 feet, a stall warning blared, alerting the pilots that the aircraft was about to fall. It was only then that they realized the engines had never powered up. The captain pushed the throttles forward, but it was too late. As Flight 521 struggled to climb, the situation became critical. The Boeing 777 was now barely 85 feet above the ground, losing speed fast. A stall warning blared, signaling that the aircraft was no longer generating enough lift to stay in the air. The pilots finally realized their mistake. The engines had remained at idle thrust throughout the go-around attempt. The captain immediately slammed the throttles forward, commanding full power, but the engines of a Boeing 777 take at least 6 seconds to spool up. With no immediate thrust and the aircraft already too slow, the plane started sinking. The pilots had no time left to recover. The first officer shouted for speed, but gravity was already pulling the aircraft back down. The runway was now directly below them, and with engines still trying to power up, the plane had no choice but to fall. The crash was now unavoidable. Flight 521 was now in free fall. With its engines still at idle, the Boeing 777 had no lift to keep it in the air. The pilots had only seconds before impact. At just 50 feet, the captain desperately pulled back on the control column, trying to keep the nose up. But without enough speed, the aircraft couldn't stay airborne. The stall warning blared again, signaling that the plane was about to drop uncontrollably. Then, disaster struck. The aircraft slammed into the runway with enormous force. The right landing gear collapsed, and the right engine tore off completely, sending debris flying across the tarmac. The plane skidded on its belly, sparks trailing behind it as it spun out of control. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as the impact threw them against their seats. The aircraft finally came to a stop, but the worst wasn't over. A massive fire was about to erupt. As Flight 521 came to a stop, thick black smoke began to rise from the wreckage. The right wing was on fire, and flames were quickly spreading across the fuselage. Inside the cabin, panic erupted. Passengers were screaming and scrambling to unbuckle their seatbelts, trying to find a way out. The cabin crew rushed to open the emergency exits, but a new problem emerged. Only 3 out of 10 exits could be used. The others were either blocked by fire or the emergency slides had been blown out of position by strong winds. With flames spreading fast, the crew fought against time to evacuate everyone. Thick smoke filled the cabin, making it difficult to see. Passengers stumbled toward the exits, pushing through the chaos. In the cockpit, the captain and senior crew stayed behind, making sure no one was left inside. But just as they were about to leave, disaster struck again. A massive explosion rocked the aircraft. As the massive explosion ripped through Flight 521, a fireball engulfed the right side of the aircraft. The force of the blast tore off a section of the wing, sending debris flying across the runway. Tragically, a firefighter on the ground was killed when a piece of wreckage struck him. Inside the burning aircraft, the captain and senior cabin crew were still searching for any remaining passengers. Smoke was suffocating, visibility was near zero, and the intense heat made it nearly impossible to breathe. Realizing they had only seconds to escape, the last crew members rushed toward an open exit and jumped onto the slide. Miraculously, every passenger and crew member survived, but 4 flight attendants suffered serious injuries from the impact. Within 7 minutes, all survivors had evacuated, far longer than the 90 seconds required by law. The Boeing 777 was now completely consumed by flames. marking the first ever total loss for Emirates. The crash of Flight 521 was a wake-up call for the aviation industry. Emirates had never lost an aircraft before, and this incident exposed critical weaknesses in pilot training and communication. Investigators found that the pilots did not fully understand the automation system, leading to the failed go-around. The fact that neither of them noticed the engines were still at idle until it was too late raised serious concerns about situational awareness in high-pressure moments. As a result, Emirates changed its training programs, introducing go-around drills after touchdown, something that was never practiced before. Air traffic controllers in Dubai also updated their procedures, ensuring that pilots were informed if other aircraft had aborted landings due to wind shear. This accident highlighted a new danger of modern automation. While it makes flying safer, it can also confuse pilots in critical moments. The tragedy of Flight 521 was a reminder that even in the most advanced aircraft, human errors can still lead to disaster.